Well, good morning, everybody. The purpose of this video is going to take a look at topic 7.5b. This is about the military and diplomacy of World War I. 7.5a we talked about in class, and we were discussing the reasons, the causes for both the war itself in Europe in 1914 and the reasons the U.S. entered the war in 1917. This is worth a little bit of a quick inset here. The more immediate causes to this have to do with the Russian Revolution, which kind of makes the course of the war more of a pressing issue across Europe. The Zimmermann telegram, which is this offer from Germany to Mexico to join the war on their side and kind of have an opportunity to regain territory for the United States. So there's a perceived threat from the United States. And then the unrestricted submarine warfare is also seen as a threat for the United States as it relates to shipping and going into Europe. So there's a little bit of trade, there's a little bit of threat, there's a little bit of democratic values. Combine that with Woodrow Wilson's real focus on democratic and humanitarian principles. Remember, this guy is a huge progressive and is trying to expand control for the middle class in many, many ways. And I think you can argue that World War I is an extension of that. But don't lose sight of the fact that this is a real departure from what the tradition of non-involvement has been. And I have a feeling that we'll come back to talk about non-involvement at the end of this recording as well. So it's worth a minute or two to kind of go through like the different types of wartime technology that are coming into existence during World War I. World War I is really characterized through the use of trench warfare. As the fighting is taking place across northern France, the safest place for any of the soldiers to be is in a defensive position in these trenches that they dig into the ground. So you can kind of see here the soldier kind of like looking ready to look up over the edge to see what's going on across the front, but you can also kind of see there's, one, two, three, there's a fourth soldier here. Like, these two guys are pretty clearly, to me, they're sleeping. I think that these two men are sleeping as well, but there is some real issue with the cleanliness and the hygiene and the level of disease that's going through some of these trenches. This is a real different situation than what's ever been seen in military activity before. This aerial view gets us a better look of like the intricacy of these trenches. So you've got the French trench work here on the western side, the left side of this map, and then you can see like the network of these German trenches going back 1, 2, 3, 4 layers deep with little connecting trenches in between. The level in between, it was considered no man's land, because if you were going to leave your position from the front line trench and try to conquer like this territory, well, the defensive position that the other side has got, they are going to be very well equipped to, well, hold their position and eliminate any kind of a potential threat. So automatically we're bringing in new elements of technology that have never been seen before in this type of warfare. One is use of airplanes, because this photograph, it's a photograph, and so this is taken by pilots that are flying over. Keep in mind, the Wright brothers invented the airplane only about a decade before the outbreak of World War I, so this is actually brand new technology. There's the development of the machine gun, which is going to really kind of give those soldiers in the trenches such a strong defensive position that it is remarkably difficult to overcome. So then the real focus of this war, because the war really bogs down to those trenches in the same space and the same spot on the map for years on end. And as they try to conquer new territory, there are hundreds of thousands of casualties. This is a real problem. And so to try to overcome those trenches, the Germans experiment with poison gas, dropping in mustard gas, which is, it's a weaponized version of mustard seed, actually. It's very concentrated, and so when it comes in contact with skins, with like the moisture in your body, it basically converts it into acid and it burns. So you can kind of see that these are victims of a gas attack, and the bandages over the eyes is because it really attacks the eyes really kind of strongly. It also attacks the lungs, because when you breathe it in, it actually forms a kind of acid in your lungs, and it can kill you, basically burning you from the inside out. Poison gas is a very controversial tactic that is used, and it is going to, kind of like, because it's so controversial, it's not going to be widely used, and it's going to kind of lead to a further entrenchment of the soldiers across northern France. And then ultimately speaking, it's what's going to be used to actually go across the trenches and go across barbed wire barricades, is the invention of the tanks. Small, like 1 or 2 person tanks here, but by the time you go from World War I to World War II, there's a real, progress that happens in terms of, well, the development of these weapons into bigger, more scarier tools of war. Yeah, in a very odd fashion, it really is the wartime technology that might be the most important thing for students to know about the changes and the big advents of what's going on during World War One. The war is being fought really all over the globe for 3.5, 4 years before the United States actually sees strong activity in this. When the United States does come in, it is in the Western Front in the, well, early part of 1918. So the context that gets us into this point is, step one is part two of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution, as it started back in March of 1917, that was a movement towards a democratic government. By the fall of 1917, and definitely going to 1918 here, the Bolshevik communists have taken over in Russia. And what that means for the course of the war is that the new Soviet government, Vladimir Lenin and those guys, they are going to negotiate a peace with the Germans, and that's going to allow the German military effort to focus exclusively on the Western Front. If you remember that they're the Central Powers, then you probably are aware that the Germans were having to fight wars both on their eastern front and on their western front. Not anymore. And so with a renewed focus on the western front, it really does look like that, France is in jeopardy of being lost. There to try to prevent this is the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. This is a very fancified term for what we would just refer to as the U.S. Army. It's an expeditionary force, even though that's hard to say. They call it this because it is the United States Army that is fighting for the first time really ever, in this kind of scale at least, outside the borders of the United States. And this is, kind of a real change for that, non-involvement to this level of involvement. This is kind of a first for what's going on here. They are under the leadership of General John J. Pershing, Blackjack Pershing. He is considered to be the military expert of World War One. In World War II, there are a few guys that fit this role, but remember, for the United States here, the level of fighting is pretty small scale compared to what's going on for the European powers. The U.S. is only in fighting for really in the neighborhood of about a year, a little bit less than a year actually. And Blackjack Pershing is the leader of this movement. As you get into the spring, into the summer of 1918, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, it begins on the Western Front. This is the last German offensive, and this is really what this map is showing. The German push to get all the way to where this black line is. And you can kind of see, like, it says the line of trench warfare. It's the end of this pink zone, which is the end of where the German offensive actually gets to, about 50 miles from Paris, and it's at the Battle of Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry. This is where the AEF and the U.S. Army, they really kind of follow through on this. Sometimes you'll see the Meuse-Argonne offensive referred to strictly as the Battle of the Argonne Forest. That's kind of a combination of like Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry and this counterattack that begins to happen. In the Battle of Argonne Forest, Sergeant Alvin York is going to distinguish himself in combat and win the Medal of Honor, Congressional Medal of Honor. Kind of what he did is here at Chateau Thierry, he is involved in the counterattack that goes on, and not only does he save the lives of his fellow soldiers in the trenches, in the course of doing all this, he pushes ahead and he is going to lead almost a one-man attack against the German front line. And in the course of this, he's going to capture 100 132 German soldiers, which is maybe as much of a sign of the German soldiers willing to surrender as it is anything about superhuman efforts from Alvin York. But this is going to make him a celebrity really for the rest of his life. There's going to be movies made about him, and this is going to, it kind of makes him kind of a real, personification of American heroism during World War One. That's going to kind of have an influence about how Americans perceive this war as you push forward into the 1920s and beyond. Ultimately, the Battle of Argonne Forest is going to be a success for the Americans and for the Allied powers. And by by November 11th, 1918, the line of armistice comes here to where this red line is, almost into German territory here in the south, and definitely reconquering Belgium. It's an armistice, which basically is a ceasefire. It's not the same as a peace treaty. We've got the peace treaty about to come up for us, but the agreement here with the armistice is to stop fighting. And November 11th, that date, for about 35 years, this is regarded as just being Armistice Day in American history. But since 1954, the idea of celebrating the veterans of World War I with Armistice Day, it's going to expand to celebrating the veterans of all American wars. And so this is Veterans Day, and it has its connection back to World War I and how the fighting stopped at 11 a.m. So it was on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. So now that the fighting has ended, attention has to turn to the peace treaty and how the United States and how Europe is going to try to address the causes that led to this war in the first place.